Sometimes the things others throw away become the most precious treasures of our lives. Sometimes a 25-cent gamble changes everything. In 1887, at a dusty livestock auction in Silver Creek, weathered cowboy Tom Mitchell did something that made the whole town shake their heads. While folks bid on prized horses and cattle, Tom walked to a wooden crate where a small, snarling pup snapped at anyone who came near. The auctioneer was practically giving the aggressive beast away. Nobody wanted a dog born to bite. But Tom saw something different. He dropped 25 cents and carried that angry pup home, ignoring the laughter and warnings. But what happened 3 months later when outlaws rode into Silver Creek with guns drawn and murder in their eyes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tom Mitchell had been 45 years old for exactly 3 months when he made the decision that would change his life forever. The decision itself seemed simple enough: buy a dog at the livestock auction. But nothing about Tom's life had been simple since the fever took his wife Sarah 2 winters before. He stood in the dusty yard of Pemberton's auction house on that sweltering August morning, watching the familiar dance of commerce unfold around him. Cowboys squinted at prize bulls, ranchers examined the teeth of promising horses, and merchants calculated the worth of everything from chickens to cattle. The air hung thick with the scent of hay, leather, and animal musk, mixed with the sweet tobacco smoke from pipes and the sharper bite of whiskey on men's breath. Tom kept his worn leather journal tucked against his vest pocket, the same journal Sarah had given him for their 5th wedding anniversary. "For your thoughts," she'd said, pressing the smooth brown leather into his calloused hands, "the ones you're always chewing on but never speak aloud." He'd filled those pages with fragments over the years: observations about weather patterns, notes about cattle prices, brief passages about the way morning light caught in Sarah's hair. Silver Creek stretched out beyond the auction yard, a town of modest ambitions and sturdy folk. 2 main streets formed a cross at the center, where the general store faced the saloon, and the church kept a respectful distance from both. Doc Peterson's office sat next to the barber shop, and Sheriff Hawkins kept his jail tidy and mostly empty. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's business but minded their own, where a handshake still meant something and a man's word carried weight. Tom had drifted into Silver Creek 6 months ago, another wandering cowboy with enough savings to rent a small spread outside town. The widow Henderson owned the property, 20 acres with a weathered cabin, a decent barn, and enough grazing for a small herd. She'd sized him up with sharp eyes, taking note of his quiet manner and the wedding ring he still wore, then named a fair price without haggling. "You seem like a man who values peace," she'd said, handing him the keys. "That land's been peaceful for years now. I trust you'll keep it that way." The townspeople had accepted him with the cautious warmth reserved for newcomers who minded their business. Sheriff Hawkins, a lean man with silver threading through his dark hair, had stopped by the ranch after Tom's first week to introduce himself properly. "Heard you were Union cavalry," the sheriff had said, settling his horse beside the fence where Tom was mending wire. "Doc Peterson mentioned it when you came in for supplies." "Long time ago," Tom had replied, testing the tension on the wire. "Different life. Good to know we've got another steady hand in town." Hawkins had touched his hat brim. "These are mostly peaceful times, but it never hurts to have men who've seen trouble before." Jake Morrison ran the Silver Dollar Saloon with the easy confidence of a man who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. He served honest whiskey, kept the gambling fair, and maintained a strict policy about respect for women. When Tom occasionally stopped in for a quiet drink, Jake never pushed conversation, but always had a friendly word ready if Tom seemed inclined to talk. "Man needs company sometimes," Jake would say, polishing glasses while Tom nursed his whiskey, "even if it's just the sound of other folks living their lives nearby." Doc Peterson was perhaps the closest thing Tom had to a friend in Silver Creek. The physician was nearing 60, with gentle hands and a practical manner that reminded Tom of his own father. Doc had served briefly as a field surgeon during the war and recognized something familiar in Tom's bearing. "Loss changes a man," Doc had said during one of Tom's visits to town. "Some men get bitter, some get reckless, some just get quiet. You strike me as the quiet type." "Quiet seems to suit me," Tom had agreed. "Nothing wrong with quiet, long as it doesn't turn into lonesome. Town could use more men who think before they act." The auction house buzzed with activity as Tom made his way through the crowd. He'd come looking for a milk cow, maybe some chickens, to make the spread feel more like a working ranch and less like a place where a man was simply marking time. Sarah had always kept chickens. She'd claimed they were better company than most people, with more interesting things to say. That's when he heard it, a low, constant growling mixed with sharp yips of anger from somewhere near the back of a lot. Other folks seemed to be giving that area a wide berth, stepping around whatever was making the commotion without bothering to look too closely. Tom's curiosity got the better of him. He found a wooden crate set apart from the other livestock, and inside it was a puppy that looked like trouble wrapped in brown and black fur. The animal couldn't have been more than 4 months old, but it snarled at anyone who approached with the ferocity of a full-grown guard dog. Its ears were pinned back, showing small but sharp teeth, and its eyes held a wild intensity that spoke of fear, anger, and absolute determination not to be touched. "What's the story on this one?" Tom asked Carl Pemberton, the auctioneer. Carl wiped sweat from his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "Found him 3 days ago, running wild out near the old Jameson place. Mother probably got killed by coyotes or wolves. Been trying to find someone to take him, but as you can see, he's not exactly friendly. Has he been fed? Much as he'll let anyone get close enough. Snaps at everything, food, water, the hand that's trying to help him. Frankly, Tom, I'm thinking about just letting him go back to the wild. Might be kinder than trying to make a pet out of something born feral." Tom studied the puppy more carefully. Beneath the aggressive display, he could see signs of intelligence in those dark eyes. The animal was scared, certainly, but there was something else there. A keenness that suggested more than simple fear was driving the hostility. "Mind if I try something?" Tom asked. Carl shrugged. "Be my guest, but I'm not responsible if he takes a chunk out of your hand." Tom knelt beside the crate, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The puppy's growling intensified, but Tom noticed the animal's eyes tracking his hands carefully. This wasn't blind aggression. It was calculated defense. "Easy there, little fellow," Tom said softly, using the same tone he'd once used to calm spooked horses. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The puppy continued to growl, but Tom caught something in the sound. Underneath the threat was exhaustion. This little warrior had been fighting for days, probably weeks, and the effort was wearing him down. Tom pulled his journal from his pocket and tore out a blank page. He folded it carefully, then slipped it through the crate slats, not reaching toward the puppy, but simply offering the paper for inspection. The growling quieted slightly as the puppy sniffed the unfamiliar object. "That's Sarah's journal," Tom murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "She always said paper held the best and worst of people. Maybe you can smell that it's held mostly good thoughts." The puppy's ears came forward just a fraction, though he remained tense and ready to strike. "How much?" Tom asked Carl, still watching the small animal. "Tom, I wouldn't ask money for that trouble. If you want him, he's yours. But I've got to warn you." "How much?" Tom repeated. Carl looked puzzled. "Well, I suppose if someone's fool enough to take him, I could ask 2 bits. That's what I'd get for a regular pup." Tom fished a quarter from his pocket and handed it to Carl. The coin was warm from his body heat and worn smooth from years of handling. He'd carried it since his wedding day. His lucky piece, Sarah had called it. "You sure about this?" Carl asked, pocketing the coin. "This animal's been nothing but tooth and claw since I found him." "I'm sure," Tom said, though he wasn't entirely certain why. Something about the puppy's defiant stance reminded him of his own feelings these past 2 years. Angry at the world, defensive against anyone who tried to get close, determined not to let anyone see the fear underneath. Getting the puppy from the crate to his wagon proved to be an adventure in itself. The small animal fought every step of the transfer, snapping at the blanket Tom used to wrap him and trying to squirm free of any restraint. But once settled in the wagon bed, surrounded by the familiar scents of leather and horse, the puppy seemed to calm slightly. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, except for the occasional whimper from the wagon bed. Tom found himself talking to the animal, sharing thoughts he usually kept locked in his journal. "Don't know what I'm doing either," he admitted as the wagon wheels found the familiar ruts of the road home. "Been wandering around lost for 2 years now, snapping at anyone who tries to help. Guess maybe we're both tired of being alone." By the time they reached the ranch, the August sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Tom carried the puppy, still wrapped in the blanket, into the barn, where he'd prepared a small pen with fresh straw and a water dish. "This is home now," he said, gently placing the bundle in the pen. "Not much to look at, but it's peaceful most days." The puppy emerged from the blanket like a small tornado, immediately exploring every corner of the pen with suspicious intensity. When Tom offered a bowl of leftover stew, the animal approached cautiously, but ate with obvious hunger. That evening, Tom sat on his porch with his journal open on his knee, writing by lamplight while the puppy settled into his new surroundings. The familiar sounds of the prairie evening, wind through grass, distant cattle lowing, the soft hoot of an owl, seemed more comforting somehow with the addition of small shuffling sounds from the barn. "Day 1, Tom wrote in his careful script. "Brought home a pup today. Sarah would have laughed at me, paying money for something that bites everyone who tries to help it. But there's something in his eyes that reminds me of looking in the mirror these past 2 years. Maybe we can figure out how to stop fighting the world together." He closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, looking out at the star-filled sky. For the first time since Sarah's death, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. The third morning dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crisp air that promised autumn wasn't far behind. Tom had developed a routine with the puppy over the past 2 days. Approach slowly, speak softly, offer food without forcing interaction, and give the small animal space to make his own choices about trust. It was working, gradually. The puppy no longer snapped at the sight of Tom's hands, though he remained wary of any sudden movements. He'd eaten regularly, and had even allowed Tom to refill his water bowl without retreating to the far corner of the pen. Tom carried his morning coffee to the barn, settling on a hay bale where he could observe his unlikely companion. The puppy was awake, sitting alert in a patch of sunlight that streamed through the barn door. For a moment, they regarded each other in comfortable silence. "Morning," Tom said quietly. "Sleep well?" The puppy's ears twitched forward at the sound of his voice. Progress from the flat-back warning posture of 2 days ago. Tom pulled out his leather journal, intending to record the small improvements he'd noticed. The puppy was definitely filling out with regular meals, and his coat was beginning to show the healthy sheen that came with proper nutrition. More importantly, the constant tension in the animal's posture was starting to ease. As Tom opened the journal to find a blank page, something fluttered out and landed on the straw between his boots. A ribbon, faded blue silk that had once been the color of summer sky. His breath caught in his throat. Sarah's prize ribbon from the county fair. 5 years past. He'd forgotten it was pressed between the journal's pages, marking the entry where he'd written about that perfect October day when she'd won first place for her apple pie. The puppy's ears came fully forward now, sensing some change in Tom's demeanor. The small animal took a cautious step closer to the edge of his pen, dark eyes fixed on Tom's face with new attention. Tom lifted the ribbon with trembling fingers, feeling the silk's softness despite its age. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Sarah, standing behind the judging table, flour still dusting her apron, her cheeks pink with excitement as the judge held up her blue ribbon. She'd looked across the crowd and found Tom's eyes, her smile bright enough to outshine the afternoon sun. "Thomas Mitchell," she'd called out, holding the ribbon high. "Come see what your wife can do with apples and flour and a little bit of love." He'd worked his way through the congratulating crowd, pride swelling in his chest. Sarah had always been talented in the kitchen, but that pie had been something special. She'd spent weeks perfecting the recipe, adjusting spices and testing different apple combinations until she'd found exactly the right balance of tart and sweet. "I had to win," she'd whispered when he reached her side, standing on her toes to kiss his cheek. "I've been telling everyone for months that I married the best man in 3 counties. Couldn't have them thinking he'd settled for a woman who couldn't even bake a proper pie." They danced that evening on the platform erected for the harvest celebration. Sarah had pinned the blue ribbon to her dress, and it had caught the light from the paper lanterns as Tom spun her around the makeshift dance floor. Other couples had joined them, but Tom had eyes only for his wife, her laughter carrying over the fiddle music and the sound of boots on wooden planks. Later, walking home under a canopy of stars, Sarah had tucked the ribbon into his journal. "For remembering," she'd said simply. "Sometimes the perfect days need to be marked special, so we can find them again when life gets hard." Tom's vision blurred as the memory faded back to the present. The ribbon hung limp in his fingers, its color dulled by time, but still holding echoes of that golden autumn day. His chest felt tight, making each breath an effort. She never got to have children. He whispered to the barn's shadowy interior. Always said she wanted a house full of little ones, wanted to teach them to bake and garden and see wonder in everyday things. The words came out cracked and raw. He'd never spoken them aloud before, had kept this particular pain locked away in the deepest part of his heart. Sarah had miscarried twice in their early years of marriage, and after the second loss, Doc Peterson had gently explained that more pregnancies would be dangerous for her health. She'd accepted the news with the same grace she brought to everything else, channeling her maternal instincts into caring for orphaned animals and neighbor children. But Tom had seen the wistfulness in her eyes when she watched families at church, had noticed how she lingered near the school when children were playing at recess. "We could have adopted," Tom continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "There were always children who needed homes. But I kept thinking we had time, kept believing. Maybe the doctors were wrong. And then the fever came, and suddenly all the time in the world wasn't enough." A soft whimper broke through his grief-clouded thoughts. Tom looked up to find the puppy pressed against the front of his pen, no longer showing any sign of aggression or fear. The small animal was watching Tom with an intensity that seemed almost human, not wary or threatening, but concerned. Without thinking, Tom extended his hand toward the pen. The puppy sniffed his fingers carefully, then did something extraordinary. He pressed his small head against Tom's palm, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. The gesture broke something loose in Tom's chest. Tears he'd held back for 2 years finally came, falling freely as he knelt beside the pen and let the puppy nuzzle his hand. The ribbon fluttered to the straw, forgotten for the moment, as man and dog found solace in their shared understanding of loss. "I don't even know what to call you," Tom managed between shaky breaths. "Can't keep saying puppy forever." The small animal looked up at him with liquid brown eyes that held depths of intelligence and empathy Tom hadn't expected to find in something so young. "Chance," he said suddenly. The name felt right on his tongue. "That's what Sarah would have called you. She always believed in second chances, in finding good where others saw only trouble." As if in approval, Chance pressed closer to the pen's edge, allowing Tom to stroke his head with gentle fingers. The transformation was remarkable. The snarling, aggressive animal of 3 days ago had disappeared, replaced by a creature capable of recognizing pain and offering comfort. Tom wiped his eyes with his sleeve and picked up the blue ribbon, holding it where Chance could see it. "This belonged to someone very special," he said quietly. "The kind of woman who would have loved you on sight, aggression and all. She had a gift for seeing the heart of things. Chance sniffed the ribbon with interest, then looked back at Tom, as if understanding the significance of this small piece of silk. "You know something about loss, don't you?" Tom observed. "Probably had someone who cared about you before the world went sideways. That's why you were so angry. Not because you're mean, but because you're grieving too." The puppy settled down next to the pen's edge, keeping his head close to Tom's hand. They sat together in the morning light, two damaged souls who found each other at precisely the right moment. When Tom finally stood to begin his daily chores, Chance whined softly, not in distress, but as if asking him not to go far. Tom smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. "I'll be back," he promised. "We've got plenty of time to figure out what comes next." As he walked toward the house, Tom tucked the blue ribbon back into his journal, but not before making a silent promise to Sarah's memory. He would give Chance the love and patience she would have offered, would honor her belief in second chances, by proving that broken things could heal when given proper care. Behind him, Chance sat watching from his pen, no longer a feral creature driven by fear and rage, but a dog beginning to remember what it felt like to trust. 2 weeks after the auction, Tom had established a rhythm to his days that revolved entirely around the small dog who had somehow become the center of his world. Each morning began with coffee and quiet conversation in the barn, followed by patient training sessions that tested both their reserves of persistence. Chance had grown noticeably in those 14 days. His legs were longer, his chest broader, and his coat had developed the lustrous sheen that came with regular meals and clean water. But more than his physical development, it was the change in his demeanor that caught Tom's attention. The constant wariness had evolved into alert curiosity, and the aggressive posturing had given way to cautious cooperation. "Sit," Tom said. For the 100th time that week, holding a small piece of jerky above Chance's head, the dog's rear end touched the ground almost immediately. This command had been mastered 3 days ago, but Tom continued to practice it because Chance seemed to take pride in performing tasks correctly. His tail, which had been tucked tight against his belly for the first week, now wagged tentatively when he succeeded. "Good boy," Tom praised, offering the treat. "Now stay." This one was trickier. Chance understood the concept, but struggled with the duration. Tom took 1 step backward, holding up his hand in the universal gesture for stop. Chance remained sitting for about 10 seconds before his patience wore thin and he bounded forward to claim his reward. "Close enough," Tom said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We'll work up to longer stays." The training sessions had become the highlight of both their days. Tom found himself looking forward to the challenge of teaching new concepts, while Chance seemed eager to learn whatever Tom was willing to teach. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. During the evenings, after the day's chores were finished and Chance was settled in his pen for the night, Tom had taken to carving. He'd found a piece of maple wood in the barn, seasoned and smooth, perfect for working with his knife. Sarah had always teased him about his restless hands during quiet moments, how he needed to keep them busy, even when his mind was at rest. The whistle had started as a simple project, something to occupy his time while sitting near Chance's pen, talking to the dog about his day or sharing memories of Sarah, but as the carving progressed, it had become something more deliberate. Tom realized he was creating a training tool, though he hadn't consciously set out to do so. Training dogs properly requires clear communication, he explained to Chance one evening as he worked on the whistle's details. Words are good, but sounds can carry farther and cut through other noises. A good whistle can mean the difference between having a dog who comes when called and having one who decides for himself what's important. Chance watched the knife work with fascination, his head tilted to one side as Tom shaped the maple into a functional instrument. The puppy had learned to recognize the evening carving routine and would settle down with a contented sigh, apparently finding comfort in Tom's presence. and the quiet sounds of wood being shaped. The whistle was taking form under Tom's patient hands, not fancy or decorated, but clean-lined and practical. He'd carved similar ones during his cavalry days, when communication between riders often meant the difference between successful reconnaissance and deadly ambush. This whistle would be smaller, higher-pitched, designed for the ears of one particular dog rather than horses in the heat of battle. "Your hearing's probably better than mine anyway," Tom said, testing the whistle's emerging tone with a soft puff of air. The sound was still rough, needing more refinement, but the basic pitch was right. "Dogs hear things we miss, footsteps at distances that would surprise you, voices carrying on the wind, trouble coming long before it arrives." As if to prove his point, Chance's head suddenly came up, ears pricked forward in sharp attention. A moment later, Tom heard it too. Hoofbeats approaching the ranch at a steady pace, not hurried, but deliberate. Tom set down his carving and moved to the barn door, Chance immediately alert beside his pen. The rider was still 100 yards out, but Tom could see enough in the fading light to know this wasn't a neighbor or anyone from town. The man sat his horse with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted, and his clothes had the worn, trail-dusty look of someone who'd been traveling hard. "Easy," Tom murmured to Chance, who had begun a low, rumbling growl, not the wild snarling of his early days, but the controlled warning of a dog who sensed potential threat. The rider pulled up near the porch and dismounted without waiting for an invitation. He was lean and weathered, with cold eyes that swept over the ranch buildings with assessing calculation. A gun hung low on his hip, positioned for quick access rather than display. "Evening," the man called out. "Looking for work, if you got any that needs doing." Tom stepped out of the barn, keeping his movements casual, but staying within quick reach of the shotgun he kept mounted inside the door. "Nothing that can't wait until morning," he replied evenly. "Town's got a hotel if you need a place for the night. Thought maybe you could spare some space in your barn. Wouldn't be any trouble." From inside the barn, Chance's growling intensified slightly, still controlled, but with an edge that spoke of readiness for action. The sound was low enough that it might not carry to the stranger, but Tom heard it clearly. "Barn's full up," Tom said, which wasn't true but seemed prudent. "Like I said, town's not far." The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly, taking in Tom's stance and the sound of the dog behind him. "That dog of yours sounds unfriendly." "He's selective about who he likes," Tom replied. "Tends to be a good judge of character." For a moment, the two men regarded each other across the yard. Tom could feel Chance's tension radiating from the barn, the dog's instincts clearly warning against this visitor. After several seconds, the stranger remounted his horse. "Might see you around," he said, though it sounded more like a promise than a casual farewell. Tom watched until the rider disappeared into the gathering dusk, then returned to the barn where Chance was pacing anxiously in his pen. "Good boy," Tom said quietly, kneeling beside the pen. "That was excellent judgment. Something about that fellow didn't sit right with me either." Chance pressed against the pen's edge, seeking the reassurance of Tom's touch. The dog's body was still tense, ready for action if needed, but he calmed under Tom's gentle stroking. "You protected me just now," Tom realized aloud. "Even penned up, you were ready to fight if I needed help." It was a revelation that stirred something deep in Tom's chest, the recognition that this small dog had already formed a bond strong enough to inspire protective instincts. Chance wasn't just learning commands and accepting food. He was choosing Tom as his person, worth defending. Against perceived threats, Tom picked up his half-finished whistle, studying the emerging tool in the lamplight. "Tomorrow, we'll start working with this," he promised Chance. "If there are more visitors like tonight's, I want to make sure we can communicate when it matters." Chance settled down with a final, watchful look toward the yard where the stranger had appeared. Even as he relaxed, his ears remained alert, listening for sounds that didn't belong to their peaceful evening routine. 1 month after the auction, Tom woke to the sound of scratching and snuffling coming from the barn. He'd left Chance free to roam the enclosed area the night before, a privilege earned through weeks of good behavior and growing trust. The dog had proven himself reliable around the ranch animals and had shown no inclination to wander beyond the property boundaries. Tom pulled on his boots and padded across the yard in the early morning light. Inside the barn, he found Chance digging industriously at a loose floorboard in the far corner, his nose pressed against the gap between planks as if following an irresistible scent. "What have you found there, boy?" Tom asked, approaching slowly. Chance looked up with bright eyes and wagged his tail, then returned to his excavation with renewed enthusiasm. The floorboard shifted under his persistent pawing, revealing a gap large enough for a curious dog to investigate. Tom knelt beside Chance and worked the board free, knowing exactly what the dog had discovered. The hiding place had been his secret. For 6 months now, a repository for items he wasn't ready to display, but couldn't bring himself to discard entirely. The cavalry saber lay wrapped in oiled cloth, its brass guard still gleaming despite years of storage. Beside it rested Tom's old field glasses, a faded photograph of his cavalry unit, and his service medals carefully preserved in a small wooden box. Chance sniffed the saber with intense curiosity, his sensitive nose clearly detecting the complex scents of oil, leather, and old metal. But more than that, Tom realized, the dog was reacting to something deeper, some understanding that these objects carried significance beyond their physical presence. "You know what this is, don't you?" Tom said quietly, lifting the saber from its wrapping. The weight felt familiar in his hands, awakening muscle memories of drills and inspections and desperate moments when steel had been the only thing standing between him and death. The saber was a presentation piece given to him after the battle of Shiloh for what his commanding officer had called exceptional courage under fire. Tom remembered the ceremony more clearly than the battle itself, standing at attention while Colonel Morrison read the citation, feeling embarrassed by the attention and eager to return to his duties. Chance sat back on his haunches, studying Tom's face as he handled the weapon. The dog seemed to sense the shift in his master's mood, the way memories could transport a man from present safety to past dangers. "I was a scout," Tom explained, settling cross-legged on the barn floor with Chance pressed against his side. "Rode ahead of the main force, gathered intelligence about enemy positions, terrain, supply lines. Dangerous work, but someone had to do it. He'd been good at it too, patient enough to spend hours motionless in hiding, observant enough to notice details that could save or doom entire companies, and skilled enough with horse and blade to fight his way out of trouble when stealth failed. The war changed everything," Tom continued, stroking Chance's head while the dog listened with the attentive stillness that had become his trademark. "Came home to Sarah thinking I'd left all that behind, that I could just be a rancher and husband, and forget about reading terrain for ambush points or listening for the sound of trouble on the wind. But the skills had remained, buried beneath layers of peaceful routine, but never truly forgotten. Even now, Tom found himself automatically noting sightlines and escape routes whenever he entered an unfamiliar place, cataloging potential threats and advantages from pure habit. Chance nuzzled the saber's scabbard, then looked up at Tom with an expression that seemed almost questioning. The dog had developed an uncanny ability to read Tom's moods, often responding to emotional cues that Tom himself wasn't fully aware of expressing. "Sarah never minded that part of me," Tom said, wrapping the saber back in its cloth covering. "She understood that some experiences mark a man permanently, that the best you can do is learn to live with them peacefully. She used to say, 'I slept like a soldier, always listening, even in dreams.' It was true. Tom had never lost the ability to sleep lightly, to wake instantly at sounds that didn't belong to his surroundings. Sarah had found it comforting rather than troubling, claiming she felt safer knowing he was naturally alert to potential dangers. Chance seemed to approve of the saber's presence, settling down beside the hiding place as if claiming guard duty. over Tom's military past. When Tom replaced the loose floorboard, the dog remained close, as though understanding that these hidden things were important to his master. That evening, as Tom prepared for bed, he noticed Chance following him toward the house instead of heading to his usual sleeping spot in the barn. "Where are you going?" Tom asked, holding the cabin door open. Chance looked up at him expectantly, then walked directly to the space beside Tom's bed and lay down with a contented sigh. The message was clear. The dog had decided that his proper place was wherever Tom was, not in the barn with the other animals. Tom found himself strangely moved by this simple declaration of loyalty. For weeks, he'd respected what he assumed was Chance's preference for sleeping alone, but apparently the dog had been waiting for permission to claim his true position as Tom's companion. "All right then," Tom said softly. "I suppose there's room for both of us." Chance's tail thumped against the floor in approval, and within minutes the dog was sleeping peacefully beside Tom's bed. The sound of his steady breathing was surprisingly comforting. The first time in 2 years that Tom hadn't fallen asleep to complete silence. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Hawkins rode up just as Tom was finishing his coffee, and Chance was completing his morning patrol of the ranch perimeter. "Morning, Tom," the sheriff called, dismounting near the porch. "Mind if we talk a few minutes?" "Course not," Tom replied, noting the serious expression on Hawkins' weathered face. "Coffee's still warm if you want some." "Much obliged." Hawkins accepted the cup gratefully and took a sip before continuing. "Got some news that concerns everyone in the area. You heard of the Crimson Gang?" Tom nodded grimly. The gang had been terrorizing communities across 3 territories for the better part of a year, robbing banks, rustling cattle, and leaving a trail of violence wherever they went. Their leader, a man called Crimson Jack, for his habit of wearing a red bandana, was said to be particularly ruthless. "They hit Millerville 2 days ago," Hawkins continued, "cleaned out the bank, killed 2 deputies, and rode off bold as brass. Word is they're heading this direction, maybe planning to winter somewhere in our territory." Chance had returned from his patrol and now sat alertly beside Tom's chair, as if sensing the gravity of the conversation. The dog's ears were pricked forward, his attention focused on Sheriff Hawkins with the intensity that had become his characteristic response to potential threats. "You think they'll hit Silver Creek?" Tom asked. "Hard to say. We're not much of a prize compared to some places, but that might make us look like easy pickings. I'm warning everyone to be extra careful. Keep eyes open for strangers who might be scouting the town." Tom thought about the unfriendly visitor from the week before, the man who'd wanted to sleep in Tom's barn, despite being told to move on to town. "I may have already had contact with one of their scouts," he said, and told Hawkins about the suspicious rider. The sheriff's expression grew more serious. "Fits the pattern. They like to have someone case a place before they move in." "Good thing you turned him away." As Hawkins prepared to leave, he paused and looked down at Chance, who had positioned himself protectively between Tom and the visitor. "That's quite a dog you've got there," the sheriff observed. "Looks like he'd fight for you if it came to that." Tom reached down to scratch Chance's ears, feeling the solid weight of the dog's presence and loyalty. "I believe he would," he said, quietly. "Question is whether we'll need him to." 6 weeks after the auction, Tom caught himself mid-sentence and realized what he'd been doing. He was standing in the pasture with Chance, checking the fence line for winter repairs, when he'd started explaining his plans for expanding the herd come spring. Thinking maybe 20 head would be about right for this size spread, he was saying to the dog, who was listening with the attentive expression that had become so familiar. "Course that would mean building another shelter before the first snow." He stopped, struck by a memory so vivid it nearly took his breath away. This was exactly how he used to talk to Sarah during evening walks around their old property, sharing thoughts and plans as naturally as breathing. She'd been his sounding board for every decision, big and small, offering insights that often saved him from costly mistakes. Chance looked up at him questioningly, as if asking why the conversation had suddenly stopped. "You're a good listener," Tom said softly, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. "Better than most people, truth be told. Sarah always said the best conversations were with folks who heard not just your words, but what you meant behind them." The realization didn't disturb him as much as it might have a month ago. Instead, he felt something close to gratitude, that this intelligent, loyal animal had somehow filled a void Tom hadn't even fully acknowledged until now. The need to share thoughts with someone who cared, to have a companion for both work and worry. Tom pulled the carved whistle from his pocket, the maple wood now smooth and warm from weeks of handling. Chance's ears immediately perked up at the sight of it. The dog had learned to associate the whistle with training sessions. But more than that, he'd come to understand the subtle variations in Tom's signals. Different tones for different commands. Combinations that meant complex instructions. Tom gave a soft, low whistle, 2 short notes followed by 1 long one. Chance immediately trotted to the fallen log they'd been using as a practice obstacle and sat beside it, waiting for the next command. A higher, sharper note sent him over the log in a graceful leap. 3 quick, staccato notes brought him racing. Back to Tom's side. "Good boy," Tom praised, offering a piece of jerky from his pocket. "You got those signals down better than some cavalry horses I've known." It was true. Chance had proven remarkably quick at learning not just individual commands, but sequences and variations that required real intelligence to master. More importantly, he never failed to respond, even when distracted by interesting scents or distant sounds. The bond between them had deepened into something that felt almost telepathic. Tom often found himself anticipating what Chance would do, while the dog seemed equally attuned to Tom's moods and intentions. Their afternoon training session was interrupted by the sound of an approaching wagon. Tom recognized Doc Peterson's distinctive rig, with its careful collection of medical supplies and the old bay horse, who knew the route to every homestead in the area. "Afternoon, Tom," Doc called, pulling up near the fence. "Mind if I water my horse? It's been a long day of house calls." "Course," Tom replied, walking over to help unhitch the bay. "Everything all right in town?" Doc Peterson studied Tom's face with the assessing gaze that had become second nature after decades of reading people's health in their expressions. "Things are fine," he said slowly, "though I have to say, you're looking better than I've seen you since you came to Silver Creek." Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Just been keeping busy." "It's more than that," Doc persisted gently. "You're talking to folks in town, making eye contact when people greet you on the street. Jake mentioned you actually laughed at one of his stories last week, said it was the first time he'd seen you smile since you arrived." Tom hadn't realized the change was so visible to others. He'd been aware of feeling less isolated, less like he was simply going through the motions of daily life, but he'd attributed that to having Chance for company. Apparently, the shift had been significant enough for others to notice. "Dog's been good for me," Tom admitted, watching Chance investigate Doc's wagon with polite curiosity. "Gives me something to focus on besides myself." "Dogs have a way of doing that," Doc agreed. "They live so completely in the present that they pull us along with them. Can't spend all your time dwelling on the past when you've got a companion who's fascinated by every moment as it happens." As if to demonstrate the point, Chance had discovered something interesting near the wagon wheel and was sniffing with intense concentration. His tail wagged slowly, and he looked back at Tom as if asking permission to investigate further. "Go ahead," Tom said, and Chance immediately returned to his exploration. Doc Peterson smiled. "See what I mean? He checked with you, but he's not worried about anything except what's happening right now. That's a gift, Tom. Learning to be present instead of lost in yesterday or tomorrow." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Chance complete his inspection of the wagon and return to Tom's side. The dog settled at Tom's feet with a contented sigh, clearly satisfied with his territorial patrol. "There's something else I wanted to mention," Doc said, his tone becoming more serious. "Been hearing more stories about that Crimson Gang. They hit another town yesterday, Copper Falls, about 60 miles north of here." Tom's attention sharpened. Anyone hurt? 3 dead, including an old man who tried to protect the bank clerk. They're getting bolder, Tom, and more violent. Sheriff Hawkins thinks they're testing how far they can push before anyone pushes back. Chance must have sensed the shift in conversation, because he raised his head alertly, looking between the 2 men as if following the discussion. The dog had developed an uncanny ability to read tension in human voices, responding to emotional cues that most animals would miss entirely. "What's Hawkins planning to do?" Tom asked. "Not much he can do with just 2 deputies and a town full of shopkeepers and ranchers. He's hoping they'll pass us by, maybe head south for the winter instead of staying in the territory." Tom touched his wedding ring absently, a habit he'd developed when thinking through difficult problems. The gold band had grown loose over the past 2 years. Grief had stolen his appetite along with everything else, but he'd never considered removing it. Sarah's ring was a reminder of promises kept and love that endured beyond death. "Hope's a thin strategy," Tom observed. "True enough. But what else can we do? This isn't the cavalry, Tom. We're just ordinary folks trying to live peaceful lives." Tom looked down at Chance, who was watching him with the steady gaze that never failed to convey both intelligence and absolute loyalty. The dog had come so far from the snarling, terrified animal in the auction crate. Given patience and care, he'd revealed himself to be brave, intelligent, and utterly devoted to protecting what mattered to him. Maybe ordinary folks could be more than they appeared to when circumstances demanded it. Sometimes peaceful folks have to make hard choices, Tom said quietly. Question is whether we're willing to make them when the time comes. Doc Peterson studied his face for a long moment. You sound like a man who's made hard choices before. Tom's hand found Chance's head, drawing comfort from the warm, solid reality of his companion's presence. We all have capabilities, we hope. Never to use, he said. But when protecting what you love is at stake, sometimes hope isn't enough. 2 months after the auction, Tom found himself standing before Sarah's mirror, really looking at his reflection for the first time in longer than he cared to remember. The mirror hung in the bedroom, positioned where Sarah used to check her. Appearance each morning before starting her day. The glass was cracked in one corner, damage from the move to Silver Creek, but Tom had kept it anyway, unable to part with something that had reflected her face for so many years. The man staring. Back at him was a stranger in many ways. The hollow-eyed, grief-stricken widower who had arrived in Silver Creek 6 months ago had been replaced by someone who stood straighter, moved with purpose, and had color in his cheeks from spending time outdoors with genuine interest rather than mere obligation. Would you look at that? Tom murmured to Chance, who was lying on the rug beside the bed. I hardly recognize myself. Chance raised his head with the alert attention that had become his signature response to Tom's voice. The dog had grown substantially over the past 8 weeks, his gangly puppy proportions giving way to the powerful build of his mature size. He was large for his breed, with intelligent dark eyes and a coat that had developed distinctive markings. Mostly brown with black patches around his ears and a white star on his chest. More than his physical development, it was Chance's personality that continued to amaze Tom. The dog demonstrated problem-solving abilities that went far beyond simple training, often anticipating Tom's needs or finding solutions to obstacles without being taught specific responses. He'd learned to open gate latches, to bring specific tools when Tom was working on repairs, and to alert him to anything unusual in their environment. You know what's different? Tom asked, settling into the chair beside the bed where he usually wrote in his journal each evening. I look like a man who has reasons to get up in the morning. It was true. The purposeless drifting that had characterized his days since Sarah's death had been replaced by routines that felt meaningful. Training Chance, improving the ranch, engaging with the community. These weren't just ways to pass time anymore, but activities that generated genuine satisfaction. Chance padded over and rested his head on Tom's knee, a gesture that had become their evening ritual. The dog seemed to understand that these quiet moments before sleep were important to Tom, times for reflection and connection. "Sarah would have loved you," Tom said, stroking Chance's ears. "She had a gift for seeing potential in things others overlooked. Remember how she rescued that half-dead apple tree when we first got married? Everyone said it would never bear fruit, but she nursed it along with patience and faith until it became the pride of our orchard." Chance's eyes remained fixed on Tom's face as if following every word. The dog had developed this habit during their evening conversations, listening with an intensity that suggested real comprehension rather than simple companionship. "She would have had you spoiled rotten within a week," Tom continued with a soft chuckle. "Probably would have sewn you a little coat for winter and insisted you sleep on the bed instead of beside it. She always said comfort was meant to be shared, not hoarded. The memory brought warmth instead of pain," another change Tom had noted in recent weeks. Thoughts of Sarah now carried joy alongside the grief, allowing him to remember the happiness of their years together rather than focusing solely on the devastation of losing her. "You know what she'd say about this whole situation with the Crimson Gang?" Tom asked, settling back in his chair. "She'd say that running from trouble just means it catches up with you when you're too tired to fight properly. Better to face it on your own terms, when you're ready and have chosen your ground." Chance's ears perked up at the change in Tom's tone. The dog had learned to recognize when conversations shifted from casual reflection to more serious subjects, responding with increased alertness as if offering his readiness to help with whatever concerns were troubling his master. A sharp knock at the door interrupted Tom's thoughts. Chance was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between Tom and the potential threat while maintaining perfect silence, a behavior they'd practiced extensively but never needed to use in earnest until now. "Tom, it's Sheriff Hawkins. Sorry to bother you so late." Tom opened the door to find the sheriff looking grim in the lamplight. Behind him stood Jake Morrison from the saloon and two other men Tom recognized from town. "What's happened?" Tom asked, noting the serious expressions on all their faces. "We need to talk," Hawkins said. "All of us. About what we're going to do when the Crimson Gang decides to pay Silver Creek a visit." Tom invited them in, and the men arranged themselves around his small sitting area while Chance settled in a corner where he could observe everyone without seeming threatening. The dog's positioning was deliberate, Tom realized. Close enough to intervene if needed, far enough away to avoid causing nervousness among the visitors. "They hit Riverside yesterday," Jake announced without preamble. "Cleaned out the bank, burned the general store, and killed anyone who tried to stop them. That's 4 towns in 6 weeks, Tom, and they're moving in a pattern that puts us right in their path." Sheriff Hawkins leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped between his knees. "I'm calling a town meeting for tomorrow night. We need to make some decisions about how we're going to handle this threat, and we need everyone involved." "What kind of decisions?" Tom asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Whether we're going to run, hide, or stand and fight," Hawkins said bluntly, "because those are our only options at this point. The territorial marshal is 3 days away at best, assuming we could even get word to him before they arrive." One of the other men, Peterson, who owned the grain mill, spoke up nervously. "Most of us aren't fighters, Sheriff. We're storekeepers and farmers. What chance would we have against experienced outlaws?" Tom found himself looking at the cracked mirror, seeing his reflection fractured but still recognizable. The man in that mirror had capabilities that Peterson and the others didn't know about, skills that he'd hoped never to use again but had never truly forgotten. "Sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things," Tom said quietly. "Question is whether we're willing to accept that responsibility or watch our community be destroyed by men who take whatever they want." Sheriff Hawkins studied Tom's face carefully. "Doc Peterson mentioned you might have some experience that could help us, military experience." Tom was quiet for a long moment, aware that his answer would change everything. Beside him, Chance seemed to sense the importance of the moment, remaining perfectly still while watching Tom's face with those intelligent dark eyes. "I have experience," Tom admitted finally, "and if the town decides to make a stand, I'll help organize our defense. But understand, once we commit to fighting, there's no going back. These men won't show mercy to anyone who opposes them." The room fell silent, except for the quiet ticking of Sarah's mantel clock and the sound of wind moving through the prairie grass outside. Tom could feel the weight of the decision settling over all of them, the recognition that their peaceful lives were about to change forever. "We'll put it to the town tomorrow night," Hawkins said finally. "Let everyone have their say before we commit to anything." As the men prepared to leave, Jake turned back to Tom. "Just so you know, if we do decide to fight, most folks will look to you for leadership. Word's gotten around that you're not just another drifting cowboy." After they'd gone, Tom sat alone with Chance in the lamplight, listening to the familiar sounds of night settling over the ranch. The dog moved closer, resting his head on Tom's foot in a gesture of solidarity. "Looks like our quiet life might be coming to an end," Tom said softly. "You ready for whatever comes next?" Chance looked up at him, with unwavering loyalty shining in his dark eyes, and Tom knew he'd found more than just a companion in that auction crate. He'd found a partner willing to stand with him against whatever dangers the future might hold. 3 months after the auction, Tom was cleaning out the old trunk in his bedroom when his fingers encountered something he'd forgotten was there. Wrapped carefully in a piece of Sarah's silk scarf was a photograph, sepia-toned and cracked with age, showing 12 men in Union cavalry uniforms standing beside their horses. Tom held the photograph up to the lamplight, studying faces he hadn't seen in over 20 years. There was Lieutenant Morrison, barely 18 when the picture was taken, who died at Gettysburg 3 months later. Sergeant Walsh, the Irishman who could track a mouse through a thunderstorm and who taught Tom half of what he knew about reading terrain. And there, third from the left, was Tom himself, younger, leaner, with eyes that held none of the grief that would come later. Chance, who had been dozing beside the trunk, suddenly came alert. The dog moved closer to the photograph, his nostrils flaring as he caught some scent that interested him intensely. But more than that, Chance was staring at the image itself, his head tilted in that particular way that indicated deep concentration. "You see something in there, boy?" Tom asked softly. Chance whined quietly, a sound Tom had learned to recognize as the dog's way of trying to communicate something important. The animal's gaze moved from the photograph to Tom's face and back again, as if making some connection that excited him. Tom studied the picture more carefully. The 12 men of Company B, 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry, Special Reconnaissance Unit. They'd been an elite group, handpicked for the most dangerous missions behind enemy lines. While regular cavalry charged into battle with sabers flashing, Tom's unit had moved like ghosts through Confederate territory, gathering intelligence that shaped entire campaigns. "We called ourselves the Ghosts," Tom said, settling cross-legged on the floor so Chance could see the photograph more easily. "We'd slip through enemy lines, map their positions, count their supplies, identify their officers. Sometimes we'd be gone for weeks at a time, living off the land and staying invisible." Chance pressed closer, his attention completely focused on Tom's words. The dog had always been an exceptional listener, but this felt different, as if Chance was recognizing something familiar in the military context. Tom's finger traced the faces of his dead comrades. "I was the youngest when we started, but I had a gift for reading country, could look at a landscape and see all the ways an enemy might use it, all the places where trouble could come from, or where safety might be found. Colonel Brooks used to say I thought like a battlefield. The memory brought back the weight of those years, the constant tension of operating deep in hostile territory, the burden of making decisions that could save or doom entire units, the lonely responsibility of being the eyes and ears for commanders who depended on accurate intelligence to keep their men alive. We lost 8 men over 3 years," Tom continued quietly. Morrison, Walsh, Cooper, Jenkins, good men who trusted me to lead them safely through enemy country. Sometimes I did. Sometimes I didn't. Chance made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and rested his head on Tom's knee. The dog's dark eyes remained fixed on the photograph, as if memorizing the faces of men he'd never met, but somehow understood were important to his master. A knock at the door interrupted Tom's reverie. He tucked the photograph back into the trunk and answered to find Sheriff Hawkins standing on his porch, holding an official-looking document. "Tom," Hawkins said gravely, "we need to talk." "Come in," Tom replied, noting the serious expression on the sheriff's face. Hawkins entered and accepted the chair Tom offered, but remained tense and formal. "I sent some telegrams after our meeting last night. Asked around about your military service, thinking it might help us understand what we're dealing with." Tom felt his stomach tighten. He'd known this moment might come eventually, but he'd hoped to keep his past buried a while longer. "And?" Tom said evenly. Hawkins unfolded the document he'd been carrying. According to the War Department, Thomas Mitchell of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry was awarded the Medal of Honor for single-handedly infiltrating Confederate General Hood's headquarters and stealing battle plans that prevented a surprise attack on Nashville. They also list him as receiving 2 Silver Stars and a Distinguished Service Cross for actions behind enemy lines. The room fell silent, except for the steady ticking of Sarah's clock and the sound of Chance's breathing from his position beside Tom's chair. "Why didn't you tell us?" Hawkins asked, though his tone held more curiosity than accusation. "Because that man died when the war ended," Tom replied quietly. "I came home planning to be nothing more than a rancher and husband. Didn't see any point in dragging old battles into a new life." "Tom, do you understand what this means? You're not just someone with military experience. You're one of the most decorated reconnaissance officers in the Union Army. The telegram says you personally conducted over 40 missions behind enemy lines with a success rate that was unprecedented in the history of cavalry operations." Chance moved closer to Tom's chair, pressing against his leg in a gesture of support. The dog seemed to sense that this conversation was causing his master distress, even though the humans were speaking in calm tones. "The war's been over for 20 years, Tom said. "Those skills don't necessarily translate to dealing with a gang of outlaws, don't they?" Hawkins challenged gently. "Reading terrain, predicting enemy movements, planning defensive strategies. Seems to me those abilities would be exactly what we need right now." Before Tom could respond, they were interrupted by urgent knocking at the door. Tom opened it to find young Billy Henderson, the widow Henderson's grandson, breathing hard from a fast ride. "Sheriff Hawkins," Billy gasped. "Ma sent me to find you quick. There's men in town asking questions about Silver Creek, about the bank, about who lives here, about whether we've got any law enforcement." Hawkins was on his feet instantly. "How many men?" "3 that I saw, but there might be more. They're in Jake's saloon right now, buying drinks and acting friendly. But Ma says they've got the look of trouble about them." Tom felt something shift inside him, old instincts awakening after years of dormancy. "Did they ask about anyone specific?" Billy nodded. "That's the strange part. One of them asked Jake if there were any ex-soldiers living around here. Said they were looking for work and wanted to know if there was anyone who might have experience with security." Tom and Hawkins exchanged glances. This was more than simple scouting. This was targeted intelligence gathering. "Billy," Tom said carefully, "did you notice anything else about these men? Their horses, their equipment, the way they carried themselves?" The boy thought for a moment. "They rode good horses, mister. And their guns weren't just for show. They were worn like men who used them regular. Ma said they reminded her of soldiers, but not the good kind." Chance had been listening to the conversation with growing alertness. Now the dog moved to the window, peering out into the darkness with the focused intensity he displayed when sensing potential threats. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not aggressive, but warning. "What is it, boy?" Tom asked, moving to the window beside his companion. Chance's ears were pricked forward, his body tense with concentration. The dog was staring into the darkness, beyond the ranch buildings, obviously detecting something that human senses couldn't perceive. "Someone's out there," Tom said quietly, his old military instincts fully engaged now. "Chance can sense them." Hawkins drew his gun and moved to the other window. "How many?" Tom studied Chance's behavior carefully. The dog wasn't showing the extreme agitation he'd displayed when confronted with immediate threats, but his alertness indicated the presence of multiple individuals at a significant distance. "At least 2, maybe more," Tom assessed. "Far enough away that they think they're hidden, but close enough to watch the house." "The Crimson Gang," Billy whispered. "Probably scouts," Tom replied, feeling the familiar calm that had always descended over him during dangerous situations. "They want to know who they're dealing with before they make their move." Hawkins looked at Tom with new understanding. "This is what you did during the war, isn't it? Read situations like this?" Tom nodded, his attention focused on analyzing their tactical situation, among other things. "And right now, the situation is telling me that we're not dealing with random outlaws anymore. They know there's something special about Silver Creek, and they've come to find out what it is." Chance moved away from the window and positioned himself near the door, ready for action, but waiting for Tom's command. The transformation in the dog was remarkable, from peaceful companion to alert guardian in the space of minutes. "What do we do?" Hawkins asked. Tom looked at the photograph still visible in the open trunk, at the faces of men who had trusted him to make the right decisions under pressure. Then he looked at Chance, whose unwavering loyalty had given him something worth protecting. "Again, we let them watch," Tom said finally. "Let them think they're being clever while we prepare for what's coming. But Sheriff, after tonight, there's no pretending this is just a possibility anymore. The Crimson Gang isn't just heading towards Silver Creek, they're specifically targeting us." "Why?" Billy asked. "We're not rich. We don't have anything worth stealing." Tom met Hawkins's eyes across the room. "They've heard about the ex-soldier living here. They want to know if I'm a threat to their operations, and after tonight, they'll know the answer to that question." Outside in the darkness, Chance continued his vigil, standing ready to defend the home and master he'd chosen as worth fighting for. Dawn broke clear and cold over Silver Creek, the kind of October morning that carried the sharp promise of winter in its breath. Tom had been awake since before first light, his old cavalry instincts refusing to let him sleep when danger was approaching. He stood on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the horizon through the field glasses he'd retrieved from his hidden cache. The binoculars were military issue, German-made precision instruments that had served him well during countless reconnaissance missions. Through their lenses he could see for miles across the rolling prairie, picking out details that would be invisible to the naked eye at such distances. Chance sat alertly beside him, the dog's behavior reflecting the tension that had been building since the previous evening. The animal hadn't relaxed his vigilance all night, occasionally moving to different windows to check various approaches to the ranch. Tom had learned to trust Chance's instincts completely. The dog's senses were far more acute than his own, and his judgment about potential threats had proven consistently accurate. "There," Tom said quietly, adjusting the focus on his field glasses. 6 riders, about 3 miles out, following the old cattle trail from the north. Through the lenses, he could make out the distinctive silhouettes of men riding hard, their horses showing signs of having traveled far and fast. They moved with the purposeful coordination of a military unit, maintaining formation even at distance. This wasn't a casual approach. It was a tactical advance. Chance's ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. The dog had apparently detected something Tom's human senses hadn't yet registered, but he remained perfectly controlled, awaiting instructions. "Easy, boy," Tom murmured, lowering the field glasses. "We've got work to do before they arrive." "Tom," had spent the previous evening after Sheriff Hawkins' departure preparing for this moment, though part of him had hoped it would never come. The town meeting had been brief but decisive. When presented with the choice between flight and resistance, the people of Silver Creek had chosen to stand and fight for their community. More importantly, they had unanimously agreed to follow Tom's tactical leadership, recognizing that his military experience was their only hope of success against experienced outlaws. Now, as the moment of confrontation approached, Tom felt the familiar weight of command settling over him. It was a sensation he'd thought he'd left behind forever. The responsibility for other people's lives, the burden of making decisions that would determine who lived and who died. He pulled the carved whistle from his pocket and gave a series of complex signals, short bursts and long notes in combinations they'd practiced extensively over the past weeks. Chance responded immediately, moving through a sequence of actions with the precision of a well-trained soldier. First, the dog trotted to the barn and retrieved a specific coil of rope, carrying it to the position Tom had designated near the main gate. Next, he moved to the water trough and performed a series of actions that would appear meaningless to observers, but were actually part of a communication system Tom had developed for coordinating defensive positions. "Perfect," Tom said softly, as Chance completed the sequence and returned to his side. "Now let's see if the rest of our preparations hold up under pressure." Over the past week, Tom had quietly transformed Silver Creek into a defensive position that would have impressed his old cavalry commanders. Using his knowledge of terrain and tactics, he'd identified key positions for riflemen, created overlapping fields of fire, and established fallback positions in case the initial defense was breached. The bank building, with its thick walls and elevated position, would serve as the command post. The general store and saloon provided excellent cover for flanking positions. Most importantly, Tom had convinced the townspeople to dig a series of concealed trenches and barricades that would funnel any attackers into predetermined killing zones. Sheriff Hawkins arrived at the ranch just as Tom finished his morning reconnaissance, bringing with him a small group of the town's most reliable men. Doc Peterson was there, carrying his medical bag and showing the calm determination of someone who'd seen battle before. Jake Morrison had traded his bartender's apron for a rifle and the steady demeanor of a man protecting his livelihood. "They're incoming," Tom reported without preamble. 6 riders, maybe an hour out if they maintain their current pace. This is it, gentlemen." The men received the news with the quiet resolve that had characterized their preparations all week. These weren't professional soldiers, but they were fighting for their homes and families, a motivation that often proved stronger than mere military training. "Positions?" Hawkins asked. Tom pulled out the hand-drawn map he'd created of Silver Creek's defensive layout. "Jake, you'll take Peterson and Williams to the general store. Doc, your position is in the bank. You'll have the best view of the entire street from those upper windows. Sheriff, you and I will coordinate from the saloon initially, then move as needed to support wherever the attack focuses." Chance had positioned himself at Tom's feet, listening to every word with the intense concentration he'd developed whenever military matters were discussed. The dog seemed to understand that these weren't casual conversations, but planning sessions that would determine the outcome of dangerous situations. "What about communication?" Doc asked practically. "How do we coordinate once the shooting starts?" Tom held up his wooden whistle. "Chance and I will maintain communication between positions. He's learned to carry messages and signal locations. He'll be our link when visibility or distance makes other communication impossible." The men looked skeptical until Tom demonstrated. A series of whistle signals sent Chance racing across the yard to a predetermined position, where he performed specific actions that clearly conveyed information about enemy positions and friendly status. The dog then returned to Tom's side with a precision that impressed even the doubters. "Remarkable," Doc Peterson murmured. "How did you teach him such complex behaviors?" "Same way the cavalry trains messenger horses," Tom replied. "Patience, repetition, and building trust until the animal understands that following commands isn't just obedience, it's survival. As the group prepared to move to their positions, Tom felt the familiar pre-battle mixture of calm and tension that had characterized his war years. His mind was clear, his hands steady, but underneath ran the current of adrenaline that would keep him sharp when violence erupted. "Tom," Sheriff Hawkins said quietly, pulling him aside, "I need to ask, are you certain about this? There's still time to evacuate the town. Try to get everyone to safety before they arrive." Tom considered the question seriously. The rational part of his mind recognized that they were farmers and shopkeepers facing experienced killers, that the odds were heavily against them, that many good people might die in the next few hours. But he thought about the suspicious rider who had scouted his ranch weeks ago, about Billy Henderson's report of strangers asking pointed questions about ex-soldiers, about the pattern of destruction the Crimson Gang had left across 3 territories. They weren't just outlaws looking for easy money. They were predators who enjoyed the terror they created, who would burn Silver Creek for sport, even if there was nothing valuable to steal. "They're not going to let us run, Sheriff," Tom said. "Finally, they've invested too much time in learning about this place, and they know about my background now. To them, I represent a potential threat that needs to be eliminated. Running would just mean they'd hunt us down when we're scattered and defenseless." Chance pressed against Tom's leg, offering the solid comfort of his presence. The dog's unwavering loyalty had become a source of strength Tom hadn't expected, knowing that at least one being in the world would stand with him regardless of the odds. "Besides," Tom added, looking around at the town that had become his home, "Sarah always said that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. These people trusted me enough to stay and defend their community. I won't abandon them now." Hawkins nodded grimly. "Then we'd better get into position. By my count, we've got maybe 30 minutes before they reach the outskirts of town." As the group dispersed to their assigned positions, Tom took one final look through his field glasses. The riders had closed to within 2 miles and were no longer making any attempt at concealment. They rode in a loose line, weapons visible, with the arrogant confidence of men who expected easy victory. Tom folded the field glasses and tucked them into his jacket pocket, then knelt beside Chance. The dog looked up at him with complete trust, ready for whatever commands might come. "This is it, boy," Tom said softly, scratching behind Chance's ears one final time. "Everything we've worked for, everything we've learned together, comes down to the next hour. You ready?" Chance's tail wagged once, briefly, then the dog settled into the alert stillness that indicated absolute readiness for action. His dark eyes held no fear, only the calm determination of a creature who had chosen his loyalty and would defend it to the death. Tom stood and walked toward the center of Silver Creek, Chance matching his pace perfectly. Behind them, the morning sun climbed higher in the clear sky, casting long shadows across the dusty main street where the fate of their small community would soon be decided. The Crimson Gang was coming, expecting to find helpless victims. Instead, they would discover that sometimes ordinary people, when pushed beyond endurance, could become extraordinary defenders of everything they held dear. Tom touched Sarah's ring one final time, drew strength from its familiar weight, and prepared to face the most important battle of his life. The Crimson Gang rode into Silver Creek at exactly 12 minutes past noon, their horses' hooves raising clouds of dust from the main street as they arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, facing the bank. Tom watched from his position on the roof of Henderson's general store. Chance crouched silently beside him, both man and dog perfectly still in the shadow of the building's false front. Through his field glasses, Tom could see the gang leader. Clearly for the first time, a tall, lean man with a red bandana tied around his neck and cold eyes that swept the apparently deserted street with practiced assessment. This was Crimson Jack himself, the man whose name had become synonymous with terror across 3 territories. The other 5 riders spread out with military precision, covering all approaches to the main street. These weren't ordinary outlaws, riding together for convenience. They moved like a unit that had fought together many times, each man knowing his role without needing verbal commands. "Nobody in sight," one of the gang members called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Looks like they got word we were coming and ran." Crimson Jack raised his hand for silence, his gaze moving methodically over the buildings that lined the street. Tom could see the man's intelligence at work, noting details that might indicate whether the town was truly abandoned or simply hiding. "Maybe," Jack said finally, "but I've learned not to trust empty streets. Rodriguez, check the saloon. Martinez, the general store. Everyone else, keep your eyes open." Tom felt Chance tense beside him as the 2 gang members dismounted and began approaching the buildings where townspeople were hidden. This was the moment when their carefully laid plans would either succeed or collapse into chaos. Tom brought the carved whistle to his lips and gave a barely audible series of notes. 3. Short, 1 long, 2 short. The signal meant enemy scouts approaching. Prepare for engagement. From his elevated position, he could see Sheriff Hawkins acknowledge the signal with a slight nod from his concealed position near the jail. Chance remained perfectly motionless. Beside Tom, every muscle coiled for action, but waiting for the command that would release him. The dog's training had reached the point where he could remain invisible and silent for hours, if necessary, but could explode into action within seconds when the situation demanded it. Rodriguez pushed through the batwing doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, his gun drawn and ready. Tom could see Jake Morrison crouched behind the bar, rifle trained on the entrance, waiting for the right moment to reveal the town's defenses. "Empty!" Rodriguez called out after a cursory search. "But the bottles behind the bar are still full. Nobody cleaned out their valuables before leaving." Martinez was having less success with the general store. Tom could see him through the windows, growing increasingly suspicious as he noticed that the cash box hadn't been emptied and personal items were still scattered on the counters. "Jack!" Martinez shouted. "Something's not right here. This place is too neat, too normal. If folks were running scared, they'd have grabbed everything valuable." Crimson Jack's expression hardened, and Tom knew their time was running short. The gang leader was too experienced to be fooled by an obvious deception much longer. "Everyone out!" Jack commanded, his voice echoing off the building facades. "I know someone's listening, so here's how this works. You've got 60 seconds to open that bank and show us where you keep the money. After that, we start burning buildings until you cooperate." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Tom could feel the tension radiating from the hidden townspeople. These were farmers and shopkeepers being threatened by killers, and their natural instinct was to comply rather than risk violence. But Tom had learned during the war that sometimes the only way to prevent greater violence was to meet aggression with decisive force. He brought the whistle to his lips again and gave the signal they'd all been waiting for, 2 long notes, followed by 3 sharp blasts. The effect was immediate and devastating. Sheriff Hawkins stepped into view from behind the jail, rifle raised. Doc Peterson appeared at an upstairs window of the bank, his weapon trained on the gang leader. Jake Morrison emerged from the saloon with his shotgun leveled, but it was Chance who created the most chaos. At Tom's whistle command, the dog launched himself from the roof in a spectacular leap, landing behind the gang's horses and immediately beginning a series of actions designed to create maximum confusion. Chance had been trained to understand that horses were prey animals, easily spooked by unexpected movement and sound. He darted between the animals, barking sharply and nipping at their heels, sending them into panic. Within seconds, 3 of the 6 gang members were fighting to control their mounts, instead of focusing on the human threats emerging around them. "It's a trap!" Martinez shouted, struggling with his rearing horse, while trying to aim his pistol at the dog, causing the chaos. Crimson Jack proved his reputation by remaining calm despite the sudden reversal. He fired a quick shot at Chance, who dodged with the fluid grace of an animal who had learned to anticipate danger, then spun in his saddle to assess the tactical situation. "Spread out," Jack commanded. "Find cover and return fire. Someone kill that dog." But Tom had anticipated this reaction. His whistle signals continued, directing Chance through a complex series of movements that kept the dog mobile and unpredictable while continuing to harass the gang's horses. More importantly, the signals coordinated the townspeople's defensive positions, ensuring they maintained crossfire coverage while avoiding shooting each other. The first exchange of gunfire cracked across Silver Creek like thunder, shattering the morning's peaceful silence. Tom could see Martinez taking cover behind a water trough, Rodriguez diving for the shelter of the bank's front steps, and two other gang members trying to establish positions that would give them clear shots at the hidden defenders. But they were no longer facing helpless victims. They were trapped in a carefully designed killing ground, surrounded by determined people fighting for their homes, coordinated by a man who understood battlefield tactics better than most professional soldiers. Crimson Jack's cold eyes found Tom's position on the rooftop, recognizing the tactical mind behind the town's suddenly effective resistance. "So," Jack called out, his voice carrying a new note of respect mixed with deadly promise, "the famous ghost finally shows himself." Before Tom could respond to Crimson Jack's challenge, he quickly untied Sarah's faded blue ribbon from his jacket pocket and secured it around Chance's collar. The silk fluttered briefly in the wind, a splash of gentle color against the violence erupting around them. "For luck," Tom whispered to the dog, who pressed briefly against his leg before returning his attention to the battle below. The gunfight had exploded into full chaos within moments of that first exchange. Martinez had found solid cover behind the water trough and was laying down steady fire toward Sheriff Hawkins' position, forcing the lawman to keep his head down. Rodriguez had managed to reach the bank's front steps, where he was trying to get an angle on Doc Peterson's upstairs window. Tom's military training took over completely now, his mind automatically calculating angles of fire, timing of reloads, and tactical opportunities. He could see the entire battlefield from his elevated position, tracking every movement and predicting each gang member's next action with the precision that had made him legendary during the war. A sharp whistle signal sent Chance racing along the rooftop to the building's rear edge, where the dog could observe the alley behind the main street. Tom had learned never to focus entirely on the obvious battle. Experienced fighters always looked for ways to flank their opponents or escape when things went badly. Sure enough, one of the gang members was trying to work his way around the back of the buildings, probably planning to attack the defenders from behind. Tom's whistle signals guided Chance through a series of movements that would intercept the flanking attempt without exposing the dog to unnecessary danger. Below, the battle had settled into a deadly rhythm of shots and movement. Jake Morrison had proven himself an excellent marksman, his shots from the saloon forcing two gang members to abandon their initial positions and seek better cover. But the outlaws were experienced fighters, and they were beginning to coordinate their own tactical response. "Peterson," Martinez shouted toward the bank, "you've got 10 seconds to throw down your weapons and open that vault, or we start shooting." "Civilians!" It was a bluff. Tom could see there were no civilians in the gang's line of fire, but it revealed their growing desperation. Crimson Jack had expected an easy victory, and the organized resistance was forcing them to escalate their threats. That's when Tom saw Rodriguez making his move. The outlaw had worked his way closer to the bank's side entrance and was preparing to rush Doc Peterson's position. The elderly physician was focused on Martinez's position and hadn't noticed the threat developing on his flank. Tom's whistle cut through the gunfire, a sharp, urgent series of notes that sent Chance leaping from the rooftop with breathtaking courage. The dog landed hard in the street below, rolled to absorb the impact, and came up running toward the bank with the speed and determination of a cavalry charge. Rodriguez had his gun raised, ready to shoot Doc Peterson through the upstairs window, when Chance hit him from behind like a brown and black thunderbolt. The outlaw's shot went wide, shattering glass instead of finding human flesh, as the dog drove him to the ground with devastating force. The impact knocked Rodriguez's pistol from his hand, and Chance immediately positioned himself between the fallen outlaw and the weapon, snarling with controlled ferocity. The man tried to reach for his gun, but Chance's warning snap convinced him to stay motionless on the ground. "Good boy!" Tom called out, pride swelling in his chest as he watched. His companion neutralized a deadly threat with perfect timing and courage, but the victory was short-lived. Crimson Jack had used the distraction to work his way closer to Tom's position, and now the gang leader's voice came from directly below the general store. "Come down from there, Ghost," Jack commanded. "Time we settled this properly." Tom looked, down to see Crimson Jack standing in the narrow alley beside the building, his gun trained on the only route Tom could use to descend from the roof. The outlaw leader had positioned himself perfectly, close enough that Tom couldn't use his rifle effectively, far enough away that jumping down would be suicide. "Your dog's impressive," Jack continued conversationally, though his gun never wavered. "But dogs can be killed just like men. Come down peaceful, and maybe I'll let him live long enough to watch you die." Tom was calculating his options when he heard the soft whistle from below, not his own signal, but Chance's way of indicating he was in position for a coordinated attack. The dog had learned to mimic some of Tom's whistle tones, creating a communication system that worked both ways. Looking down, Tom could see Chance had somehow worked his way behind Crimson Jack's position, while the gang leader was focused on the rooftop. Sarah's blue ribbon fluttered from the dog's collar as he crouched in the shadows, waiting for Tom's command. It was a moment that required perfect timing and absolute trust. Tom would have to expose himself to Crimson Jack's gun while counting, on chance to attack at precisely the right instant. "You're right about the dog," Tom called down, making sure his voice would hold Jack's attention. "He is impressive, but you made one mistake." "What's that?" Jack asked, curious despite himself. "You assumed I was fighting alone." Tom's whistle signal was sharp and final, the cavalry command for charge. Chance exploded from the shadows with the force of controlled fury, hitting Crimson Jack from behind just as Tom dropped from the roof with his rifle ready. The gang leader spun, trying to bring his gun to bear on either target, but found himself caught between two perfectly coordinated opponents. Tom's rifle barrel pressed against Jack's chest while Chance's teeth were inches from his throat, the blue ribbon on the dog's collar fluttering like a battle flag. "Drop it," Tom said quietly, and Crimson Jack's pistol fell to the dust of silver. Greek's main street. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of surrender coming from the remaining gang members, their leader's capture having broken their resistance as effectively as any military victory. Tom looked down at Chance, whose intelligent eyes held satisfaction and absolute loyalty. Sarah's ribbon caught the afternoon light, a gentle reminder that some battles are worth fighting, and that courage comes in many forms, sometimes in the heart of a man defending his community, and sometimes in the devotion of a dog who chooses to stand beside him against impossible odds. The aftermath of the battle brought a strange quiet to Silver Creek, broken only by the sounds of cleanup and the gentle ministrations of Doc Peterson as he tended to wounds. Miraculously, none of the townspeople had been seriously injured, though Martinez had managed to graze Sheriff Hawkins' arm before surrendering. The Crimson Gang hadn't been as fortunate. 2 members required Doc's immediate attention, while the others nursed injuries that would serve as permanent reminders of their failed raid. Tom found himself moving through the post-battle activities with the same methodical efficiency he'd once brought to cavalry operations. He helped secure the prisoners, organized the recovery of weapons and evidence, and coordinated with Sheriff Hawkins on the logistics of holding 6 dangerous men until the territorial marshal could arrive. But it was Chance who drew the most attention from the townspeople. The dog had positioned himself near the jail, keeping watchful guard over the captured gang members while somehow managing to greet every person who approached with the gentle demeanor that had become his trademark with friendly humans. "Never seen anything like it," Jake Morrison said, offering Chance a piece of jerky while the dog maintained his vigilant posture. "One minute he's fighting like a wild animal, the next he's gentle as a lamb with the children." It was true. Word of the battle had spread quickly, and families who had evacuated to the countryside were beginning to return to assess the damage. The children, especially, were fascinated by Chance's role in defending their town, though the dog accepted their attention with patient dignity rather than seeking praise. Mrs. Henderson, the widow who owned Tom's ranch, approached him as he finished giving his statement to Sheriff Hawkins about the gang's capture. "Thomas Mitchell," she said in the no-nonsense tone that had made her a respected figure in the community for 30 years, "I want you to know that your rent arrangement has changed." Tom felt his stomach tighten, wondering if the violence would cost him his home in Silver Creek. "Changed how, Mom?" he asked respectfully. "You don't pay rent anymore," she said firmly. "What you did today, what you and that remarkable dog did, means you've earned your place here permanently. That land is yours now, free and clear, with my compliments and gratitude." Similar conversations followed throughout the afternoon. The general store owner insisted Tom's credit was good for life. Doc Peterson offered his medical services free of charge whenever needed. Jake Morrison declared that Tom's first drink would always be on the house at the Silver Dollar. But more than the material offers, it was the change in how people looked at him that affected Tom most deeply. The polite distance that had characterized his interactions with the community for months had been replaced by genuine warmth and acceptance. He was no longer the quiet stranger who kept to himself, but a neighbor who had proven his commitment to their shared home. As the sun began to set on that extraordinary day, Tom walked home with Chance trotting beside him, both of them tired, but satisfied with the day's work. The ranch looked exactly as they'd left it that morning, but somehow it felt different, more like a permanent home and less like a temporary resting place. Over the following weeks, Tom settled into a new routine that involved more interaction with Silver Creek's daily life. Sheriff Hawkins consulted him regularly on security matters, drawing on his tactical knowledge to improve the town's defenses. Local ranchers sought his advice on protecting their livestock from rustlers. Even the school teacher asked him to speak to the older children about courage and responsibility. Through it all, Chance remained his constant companion, seeming to understand that their role in the community had evolved from simple residence to active protection. The dog continued his daily patrols of the ranch, but expanded them to include regular visits to town, where he'd become a familiar and welcome sight on the main street. 6 months after the confrontation with the Crimson Gang, Tom made a decision, and that surprised even himself. He visited the leather worker in the county seat and commissioned a special collar for Chance, rich brown leather with silver fittings, and a nameplate that read Chance Mitchell in elegant script. When he fastened the collar around Chance's neck, the dog seemed to understand the significance of the moment. His tail wagged with genuine pleasure, and he sat with obvious pride, as if recognizing that he now bore the family name along with its responsibilities. "There," Tom said softly, admiring how the collar looked on his companion. "Now it's official. You're not just my dog, you're my partner and my family." The next day, Tom took Chance to the small cemetery outside Silver Creek, where Sarah was buried. It was the first time he'd visited her grave since arriving in the territory, and he'd been uncertain how the experience would affect him. But standing there with Chance beside him, Tom found he could speak to Sarah's memory without the crushing weight of grief that had characterized so many previous attempts at communication. "I want you to meet Chance," Tom said quietly, his hand resting on the dog's head. "He's the one I told you about in my letters, the angry pup who taught me that. Broken things can heal when they're given proper care and patience." Chance seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment, sitting quietly while Tom shared stories of their adventures together, the battle with the Crimson Gang, and the way their partnership had helped him find purpose again. "I think you'd approve of how things turned out," Tom continued. "I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living again, participating in a community, protecting people who matter to me. Chance helped me remember that isolation isn't the same thing as peace." As they prepared to leave, Tom noticed that Chance had placed a small wildflower at the base of Sarah's headstone. Not trained behavior, but spontaneous tribute from an animal who seemed to understand that this woman had been important to his master. That evening, Tom sat on his porch with his journal open on his knee, trying to find words for the transformation that had occurred in his life. Chance lay beside his chair, contentedly watching the sun set over the prairie they both called home. 3 months and 25 cents, Tom wrote in his careful script. That's what it cost to buy a second chance at life, though I didn't understand it at the time. Sarah always said that love finds us in unexpected packages, often when we least expect it and most need it. He paused in his writing to look down at Chance, whose intelligent eyes reflected the lamplight with warmth and contentment. She was right, as usual. Sometimes the most precious treasures come disguised as problems nobody else wants. Sometimes a quarter spent in faith returns dividends beyond measure. Tom closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, listening to the familiar sounds of evening settling over Silver Creek. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called to its mate. Closer by, cattle lowed softly as they settled for the night. And beside him, Chance's steady breathing provided the comforting rhythm of companionship and loyalty freely given. For the first time in years, Tom Mitchell felt completely at peace with his place in the world, knowing that he'd found not just a home, but a purpose worth defending, and a partnership worth cherishing for whatever years remained to them both.